At the height of World War II, Adolf Hitler wasn't just one of the most powerful men on earth. He was also, quite possibly, one of the richest. But how did a failed artist who once lived in a homeless shelter amass a fortune that would rival today's billionaires? And more mysteriously, what happened to all that wealth when the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash? Today, we're going to trace the extraordinary financial journey of history's most infamous dictator. From penniless vagrant to multimillionaire Führer, this is a story of corruption, greed, and the systematic looting of an entire nation. We'll uncover the hidden bank accounts, the stolen art treasures, the corporate bribes, and the ingenious money-making schemes that made Hitler obscenely wealthy. And we'll follow the trail of that blood-stained fortune through the ruins of Berlin to its ultimate fate in the hands of the Allied victors. This is the untold story of Hitler's wealth. The quest for the Führer's fortune. To understand how Hitler became so wealthy, we need to start at the beginning. And contrary to what many assume, Hitler wasn't born into poverty, nor was he born into privilege. His origins were solidly, unremarkably middle class. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn. His father, Alois Hitler, worked as a customs official for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a respectable position, the kind of stable civil service job that provided security and a modest but comfortable income for the family. The Hitlers weren't rich by any means, but they weren't struggling either. They occupied that vast middle ground of late 19th century European society. Enough money for necessities and a few small luxuries, but little left over for extravagance. Alois Hitler was a stern, authoritarian figure who took pride in his career. Over 3 decades of loyal service to the imperial government, he managed to accumulate a reasonable sum in savings and pension benefits. This was the modest inheritance that young Adolf would eventually receive after both his parents died, his father in 1903 and his mother in 1907. But whatever financial security his father's prudence had provided, Adolf Hitler managed to squander it with remarkable speed. After dropping out of school at 16, Hitler nursed grand dreams of becoming an artist. He moved to Vienna in 1907, Austria's glittering imperial capital, with visions of studying at the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. But the Academy rejected his application twice. His technical skills were deemed inadequate. His famous architectural drawings showed promise, they said, but his human figures were stiff and lifeless. Stubborn and delusional about his artistic talents, Hitler refused to pursue any practical career. He drifted through Vienna, burning through his inheritance and his orphan's pension. He sold the occasional watercolor or postcard to tourists, barely scraping by. By 1909, just 2 years after arriving in the city with hopes and money, Hitler found himself virtually destitute. He was forced to take shelter in a men's hostel, a facility for the homeless and unemployed. The future dictator of Germany spent months living alongside vagrants, alcoholics, and the desperately poor, occasionally finding work as a day laborer on construction sites or snow-shoveling crews. This period of genuine poverty would later become a propaganda tool. Nazi mythology would portray Hitler as a man who understood the suffering of ordinary Germans because he had suffered himself. But the truth was more mundane. Hitler's poverty was self-inflicted, the result of his own stubborn refusal to pursue honest, practical work while he chased an impossible artistic dream. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 provided Hitler with a sense of purpose he'd never known before. He volunteered for the Bavarian Army and served as a dispatch runner on the Western Front. It was dangerous work carrying messages between command posts under artillery fire, but Hitler seemed to thrive in the military environment. For the first time in his life, he belonged to something larger than himself. He served with dedication and was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and, remarkably, the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, an unusual honor for a soldier of his rank. But military service didn't make him rich. As a lance corporal, Hitler earned a meager wage, barely enough to cover his basic needs. When the war ended in November 1918 with Germany's humiliating defeat, Hitler found himself once again adrift and impoverished. The chaos of post-war Germany would prove to be Hitler's opportunity. In 1919, still working for the military, he was assigned to spy on political groups in Munich. The army was concerned about communist and socialist agitation in the chaotic aftermath of defeat and revolution. One of the groups Hitler was sent to infiltrate was a tiny, obscure organization called the German Workers' Party. But instead of reporting on the party, Hitler joined it. He discovered he had a gift for rabble-rousing public speaking, and his angry, passionate speeches about Germany's humiliation and the so-called November criminals who had betrayed the nation struck a chord with disaffected veterans and nationalists. Within months, Hitler had become the party's most effective propagandist. The German Workers' Party was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, abbreviated as Nazi, and Hitler took control. But even as the party's leader, Hitler remained poor. The Nazi Party in the early 1920s was a fringe movement with little money and few members. Hitler lived in a small, shabby room in Munich, wore the same threadbare suits, and often depended on the generosity of early supporters for meals. However, this began to change as wealthy sympathizers took notice of this fiery speaker who seemed to articulate their fears about communism, democracy, and Germany's decline. Money started trickling in, small donations at first, then larger sums from businessmen and aristocrats who saw in Hitler a bulwark against Bolshevism. By the early 1920s, Hitler could afford a modest apartment and, significantly, his first Mercedes automobile. The car became an important symbol. In an era when automobiles were still luxury items, Hitler's Mercedes signaled that he was a man of importance, a leader worth following. But Hitler wanted more. In November 1923, he attempted to seize power in Munich in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup failed miserably. Several Nazis were killed by police, and Hitler was arrested and tried for treason. He was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, though he would serve less than 9 months before being released early. It was in prison that Hitler made the decision that would transform his finances forever. He would write a book. Hitler's time in Landsberg prison was, by prison standards, remarkably comfortable. He had a spacious cell with a view, received visitors freely, and was treated with considerable deference by the guards. He used this time to dictate his political autobiography to fellow Nazi prisoner Rudolf Hess, and later to his chauffeur. The result was Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. The book was part autobiography, part political manifesto, part rambling racist ideology. It outlined Hitler's worldview, his hatred of Jews, his contempt for democracy, his belief in German racial superiority, and his vision for Germany's future domination of Europe. As literature, it was turgid and repetitive. As a historical document, it was a terrifying blueprint for the horrors to come. But as a financial venture, it would prove to be spectacularly successful. The first volume of Mein Kampf was published in July 1925, shortly after Hitler's release from prison. The second volume followed in December 1926. Initial sales were modest. The Nazi Party was in disarray after the failed putsch, and Hitler needed the income desperately. The party had been banned, then reformed, and was struggling to gain traction through legitimate electoral politics. But as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, as the Great Depression devastated Germany's economy and threw millions out of work, as democratic institutions seemed paralyzed and ineffective, the Nazi message found a receptive audience, and Mein Kampf's sales climbed steadily. Between 1925 and 1933, before Hitler became chancellor, the book sold approximately 240,000 copies. This generated royalties of about 1.2 million Reichsmarks for Hitler. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to approximately $5.6 million in today's money. For a man who had been living in homeless shelters just 15 years earlier, this was a fortune. But here's where Hitler's character truly reveals itself. Despite earning enormous sums from his book, Hitler refused to pay income tax on these royalties. He simply ignored the tax bills. By 1933, the German tax authorities had calculated that Hitler owed around 400,000 Reichsmarks in back taxes, equivalent to about $1.6 million today. It was a staggering sum, enough to bankrupt him. But by the time this tax bill arrived, Hitler was no longer just another German citizen. He was the Chancellor of Germany, and powerful chancellors don't pay their taxes if they don't want to. Through intermediaries in the Reich Chancellery, Hitler arranged to have himself declared officially tax-exempt. The Führer would never pay taxes again. After Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Mein Kampf transformed from a popular book into something approaching an official state publication. It became virtually mandatory reading. Copies were given to newlywed couples as wedding gifts from the state. Schools purchased copies for their libraries. Local Nazi Party offices distributed copies to members. By the time war broke out in September 1939, 5.2 million copies had been sold in 11 languages, including English, French, and Italian. The book continued to sell throughout the war years, its popularity fueled by Nazi propaganda and Hitler's growing personality cult. By the time of Germany's defeat in May 1945, nearly 10 million copies had been sold or distributed in Germany alone. Each copy generated royalties that flowed into Hitler's coffers. The precise amount Hitler earned from Mein Kampf over his lifetime is difficult to calculate exactly, but historians estimate it was in the tens of millions of Reichsmarks, making him wealthy by any standard. Hitler used some of this money to fund his increasingly lavish lifestyle. He purchased a luxury apartment in Munich and began construction on what would become his mountain retreat, the Berghof, in the Bavarian Alps near Berchtesgaden. But Mein Kampf royalties were just the beginning of Hitler's wealth accumulation. There were many other sources of income, both legitimate and deeply corrupt. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933, he began receiving a government salary. This was a legitimate payment for the head of government, similar to how any prime minister or president receives official compensation. The salary was substantial, reflecting the importance of the office. But Hitler wasn't satisfied with just one government paycheck. In August 1934, when elderly President Paul von Hindenburg died, Hitler saw an opportunity. Rather than allow the German parliament to elect a new president, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President into a single new position that he called Führer und Reichskanzler, Führer and Reich Chancellor. This gave him absolute power as both head of government and head of state. But here's the crucial detail. Hitler didn't just take on the combined responsibilities of both offices. He also paid himself both salaries. He continued to collect his chancellor's salary while simultaneously pocketing the former president's salary. This dual payment was entirely self-approved. No one was in a position to question the Führer's financial arrangements. These salaries alone were substantial, but they were nothing compared to the flood of donations that poured in from German corporations and wealthy industrialists. This is where Hitler's wealth truly became astronomical. Major German corporations saw Hitler as a useful tool. He promised to destroy the communist movement, to crush labor unions, to rearm Germany and provide lucrative military contracts, and to pursue aggressive expansionist policies that would benefit German business. In return, they were willing to pay handsomely. One of Hitler's earliest foreign admirers and financial supporters was Henry Ford, the American automobile magnate. Ford was a notorious anti-Semite who had published a book called The International Jew, and who saw in Hitler a kindred spirit. Ford provided financial support to the Nazi Party in its early days, though the exact amounts remain disputed by historians. Once Hitler came to power, German industrialists opened their wallets wide. Gustav Krupp, whose family controlled the massive Krupp steel and armaments empire, became a devoted Nazi supporter. Fritz Thyssen, another steel magnate, was equally generous. Together, Krupp and Thyssen are estimated to have donated over 5 million Reichsmarks to the Nazi Party during the 12 years of Nazi rule, equivalent to approximately $37.2 million today. While not all of this money went directly into Hitler's personal accounts, a substantial portion benefited him directly through various schemes. The chemical giant IG Farben, which would later produce the Zyklon B gas used in the death camps, was another major contributor. German banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing firms all lined up to curry favor with the regime through generous donations. These weren't charitable gifts, they were investments. In return for their financial support, these corporations received lucrative government contracts, favorable regulations, protection from labor disputes, and the opportunity to use slave labor from concentration camps. It was a corrupt bargain that enriched both Hitler and his corporate supporters. Hitler's private secretary, Martin Bormann, played a crucial role in managing this flood of corporate money. Bormann was a shadowy figure, rarely photographed, seldom in the public eye, but enormously powerful behind the scenes. He controlled access to Hitler and managed the Führer's personal finances with ruthless efficiency. Bormann established special funds that existed outside normal government channels. Corporate donations flowed into these secret accounts, which Bormann then used to finance special projects for Hitler's personal benefit. The most famous example was the Eagle's Nest, a dramatic stone building constructed on a mountaintop high above the Berghof. It cost millions to build and was funded entirely through these corporate donations. Hitler visited it fewer than a dozen times, but it served as a powerful symbol of the Führer's grandeur. Historians who have studied Hitler's finances estimate that between 1933 and 1945, Hitler personally received approximately 700 million Reichsmarks from various corporate and private donors. That's equivalent to roughly $5.2 billion in today's money. This staggering sum made Hitler one of the wealthiest individuals in the world at the time, comparable to the great American industrialists and financiers of the era. But wait, there's more. Hitler devised yet another ingenious scheme to generate personal wealth, one so audacious that it would be almost comical if it weren't so effective. He charged a royalty on his own image whenever it appeared on German postage stamps. Think about that for a moment. Every time a German citizen purchased a postage stamp bearing Hitler's portrait, and there were millions of such stamps, a small percentage of that purchase price went directly to Hitler as a royalty payment. It was as if the Führer had trademarked his own face and was charging licensing fees to the German Postal Service. This generated millions of additional Reichsmarks for Hitler. Germans sent millions of letters and parcels every year. The Postal Service issued stamp after stamp featuring Hitler's image, each one adding a few pfennigs to the Führer's fortune. Over the course of 12 years, these tiny royalty payments accumulated into a substantial sum. Hitler's business manager, Max Amann, handled the logistics of collecting these payments and managing the resulting wealth. Amann was an old comrade from Hitler's World War I regiment, a loyal Nazi who had been there from the beginning. Hitler trusted him implicitly, and Amann used that trust to build a complex financial structure designed to hide and protect the Führer's wealth. Amann spread Hitler's money across multiple bank accounts in different German cities. He invested in real estate, purchasing properties in Hitler's name or through shell companies. He bought art, both as investment and because Hitler fancied himself a connoisseur. He diversified the portfolio to include stocks, bonds, and other financial instruments. The goal was twofold: to grow Hitler's wealth and to make it difficult for anyone to determine exactly how much money the Führer had accumulated. Even today, historians can only estimate Hitler's total wealth because the financial records were so deliberately obscured. Hitler also received income from photographic royalties. Whenever his image was used in newspapers, magazines, books, or propaganda materials, unless it was official government material, a royalty payment was supposed to be made. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, managed these image rights and ensured that money flowed to Hitler whenever his photograph was commercially used. All of these income streams, combined with the book royalties, the dual, salaries, and the corporate donations, created a financial empire that sustained Hitler's increasingly lavish lifestyle. So how did Hitler spend this enormous fortune? What does a dictator buy when money is no object? The most famous example of Hitler's spending was the Berghof, his alpine retreat near Berchtesgaden in Bavaria. What started as a modest mountain cottage that Hitler rented in the 1920s became, through years of expansion and renovation, a sprawling complex of buildings with stunning views of the Alps. Hitler poured millions of Reichsmarks into the Berghof. The main house was rebuilt and expanded into a grand residence with enormous windows offering panoramic mountain views, a vast reception hall where Hitler conducted informal diplomatic meetings, comfortable private quarters, and spaces for his large staff. The property included multiple guest houses, barracks for SS guards, a complex of underground bunkers, and extensive gardens and walking paths. The furnishings were luxurious. Expensive tapestries hung on the walls. The furniture was custom-made. The Berghof's famous Great Hall featured a massive window that could be lowered into the floor at the touch of a button, opening the room entirely to the mountain air. It was a feature Hitler loved to demonstrate to visitors, a technological marvel that symbolized modern German engineering. Hitler also maintained a luxury apartment in Munich on Prinzregentenplatz. This spacious 9-room apartment was lavishly furnished and served as his official Munich residence when he was in the city. Though after becoming Führer, Hitler spent less time in Munich and more in Berlin and at the Berghof. But Hitler's most expensive passion was art. Hitler fancied himself an artist and an art connoisseur, and he spent enormous sums acquiring paintings, sculptures, and other artworks. Some of this art was legally purchased. Hitler sent agents to auctions and galleries across Europe with instructions to buy specific pieces, regardless of cost. However, much of Hitler's art collection was simply stolen. As German armies conquered Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, and other nations, special SS units called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or ERR, systematically looted museums, private collections, and Jewish homes. They seized hundreds of thousands of artworks, many of which were earmarked for Hitler's personal collection. Hitler had grand plans for this stolen art. He envisioned building a massive museum in Linz, Austria, the city where he had spent part of his childhood. This so-called Führer Museum would house the greatest art collection in the world, a testament to German cultural superiority. Hitler spent hours reviewing catalogs of seized artworks, selecting pieces for his future museum. Plans were drawn up for the Führer Museum. Models were built. Hitler was obsessed with the project, seeing it as a key part of his legacy. Of course, the museum was never built. The war, consumed resources, and Allied bombing made large construction projects impossible in the later years of the conflict. But the plans reveal Hitler's megalomania and his desire to use his ill-gotten wealth to create lasting monuments to his rule. Hitler also spent money on personal comforts. He employed a large household staff, cooks, drivers, secretaries, and valets. He maintained multiple residences simultaneously. He traveled in armored Mercedes automobiles and special trains equipped with every luxury. He entertained foreign dignitaries and Nazi officials with lavish dinners and receptions. Yet, paradoxically, Hitler also cultivated a public image of personal austerity. Nazi propaganda portrayed him as a simple man, a vegetarian who didn't smoke or drink, who cared nothing for personal wealth, and lived only to serve Germany. He was photographed wearing simple uniforms, eating plain meals, playing with his German shepherd Blondie. This image was carefully crafted to appeal to ordinary Germans who admired his supposed modesty even as he lived in luxury. By April 1945, Hitler's empire was collapsing. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin. American and British armies were advancing from the west. The Berghof had been badly damaged by Allied bombing. Germany was defeated, and Hitler knew it. In the early morning hours of April 29, 1945, in the suffocating confines of the Führer bunker, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Hitler dictated his last will and testament to his secretary, Traudl Junge. He had married Eva Braun just hours earlier, and now, with the end approaching, he was putting his affairs in order. The will was a remarkably petty document. Even facing death and Germany's utter defeat, Hitler used his final statement to blame everyone else for the disaster: Jews, traitors, cowards, anyone but himself. But the will also contained instructions regarding his property and wealth. Hitler appointed Martin Bormann as executor of his will. His extensive art collection, both the legally purchased pieces and the looted works, he left to a gallery to be built in Linz, the Führer Museum that would never exist. Various personal items of sentimental value, photographs, letters, small mementos, were bequeathed to specific individuals, relatives, his housekeeper, and longtime servants. But the bulk of his estate, his properties, and his money, Hitler left to the Nazi Party. And if the party no longer existed at the time of his death, which Hitler must have known was likely, then everything would go to the German state. On April 30, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in the bunker. Their bodies were carried up to the Reich Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline, and burned. The Third Reich survived Hitler by just 1 week. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. So what happened to Hitler's vast fortune? In the chaotic aftermath of Germany's defeat, the Allied powers began the enormous task of occupying and administering a shattered nation. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin itself was similarly divided among the 4 powers. As Allied investigators began examining Nazi financial records, the scope of Hitler's wealth became apparent. But actually seizing those assets proved complicated. Hitler's properties were easily accounted for. The Berghof was in ruins, badly damaged by Allied bombing, and then looted by occupying forces. Hitler's Munich apartment fell into Allied hands. Other properties could be identified and seized. But the money was harder to trace. Max Amann had done his job well, spreading Hitler's wealth across multiple accounts and investments. Some records had been destroyed in the final days of the war. Other documents were lost in the chaos. Still more had been deliberately hidden or falsified. What money could be found was seized by the occupation authorities. Bank accounts were frozen, investments were confiscated, artworks were recovered, though tens of thousands of pieces remained missing, hidden in private collections or lost forever. The legal question of who owned Hitler's assets was surprisingly complex. According to Hitler's will, everything should go to the German state. But the German state had ceased to exist. Germany was now occupied territory, divided among the Allied powers. So who inherited Hitler's fortune? The answer came in 1949 when the British, American, and French occupation zones merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany. This new German state, by default, inherited whatever remained of Hitler's assets within its territory. The Soviet occupation zone became East Germany, a separate communist state, and whatever assets existed there fell under Soviet control. Within West Germany, the state of Bavaria made the strongest claim to Hitler's estate. Hitler had been legally resident in Bavaria at the time of his death, even though he actually died in Berlin. Under German law, this gave Bavaria jurisdiction over his estate. The Bavarian government took control of what remained of Hitler's wealth, but this created its own problems. What do you do with blood money? How do you handle assets acquired through corruption and genocide? The case of Mein Kampf illustrates the dilemma. The book remained in print internationally after Hitler's death, continuing to generate royalty income. The Bavarian government, as copyright holder, received these royalties. But they refused to authorize any new German publication of the book. For 70 years, from 1945 to 2015, Mein Kampf could not be legally published in Germany. Foreign royalties presented special challenges. In the United States, when Hitler declared war on America in December 1941, the U.S. government seized control of Hitler's American publishing royalties under the Trading with the Enemy Act. By 1945, these frozen royalties amounted to $255,000. The money was distributed to war refugee charities. In 1945, the American publisher Houghton Mifflin purchased the U.S. rights to Mein Kampf from the government's Office of Alien Property for $37,000. Over the next 20 years, American sales generated approximately $700,000 in royalties. Following public pressure, Houghton Mifflin eventually donated these profits to charity, though not without controversy about who should receive such tainted money. In Britain, Mein Kampf was banned from publication from 1945 until 1969. After the ban was lifted, publishers struggled with the ethical question of what to do with the royalties. They attempted to donate the money to charities, but many organizations refused to accept it. Some foreign royalties were eventually given to the Bavarian government, which quietly distributed them to charitable causes. Then, on January 1, 2016, 70 years after Hitler's death, Mein Kampf entered the public domain. The copyright expired under German law. Almost immediately, a heavily annotated scholarly edition was published in Germany. Scholars had added thousands of footnotes, explaining, contextualizing, and refuting Hitler's claims. The book became an instant bestseller, selling out on Amazon's German website within hours. By 2017, this new edition had sold over 85,000 copies in Germany alone. The success sparked debate. Should the book be available at all? Does publishing it, even with critical commentary, give Hitler a platform? Or is it important to study the document to understand how such evil took root? The controversy continues. So what became of Hitler's vast fortune? The answer is both simple and unsatisfying. It was seized, liquidated, and absorbed by the German state, primarily Bavaria. There is no vast fortune sitting in Swiss bank accounts waiting to be claimed. There are no hidden treasures buried in the Alps. Hitler's relatives, the descendants of his half-siblings, have no claim to any wealth. Whatever money could be found was distributed or absorbed into government coffers. Much of it was likely used for reconstruction in the devastated post-war years. Some went to reparations and victim compensation. The art collection was partly recovered, with pieces returned to their rightful owners or placed in museums. But tens of thousands of artworks remain missing to this day. Hitler's story is ultimately a testament to the corrupting nature of absolute power. A failed artist who once sold postcards on Viennese street corners used political extremism to acquire wealth beyond measure. He became one of the richest men in Europe by taxing stamps bearing his own face, by demanding corporate bribes, by looting conquered nations, and by creating a personality cult that made his rambling book a mandatory purchase. But all his wealth bought him nothing of lasting value. His grand museum was never built. His alpine retreat was destroyed. His books became symbols of evil. And he died in a concrete bunker, having brought ruin to his nation and death to millions. The quest for the Führer's fortune reveals not just the mechanics of Nazi corruption, but the ultimate emptiness of power built on hatred and lies. Hitler died with nothing, and his legacy is ashes. Thank you for watching.